Resume recording. Here we go. So welcome again to 171. So for those of you who are here live, thanks for being here. And if you are not, then you can still watch the lecture on YouTube. I'll be posting that subsequent to the recording. It takes a few minutes for the file to convert and then to post it on YouTube. So hopefully by around 3 o'clock today, this will be available to you. Now, today we're going to be talking about negative punishment, and we'll talk about timeout and response cost. I might be able to finish the chapter today. If not, we'll continue next class. So this is a few reminders about punishment that I think are important for you guys to understand. So just like reinforcement, discrimination, extinction, and all the other procedures that we've talked about, punishment is a basic behavioral principle. So we're not talking about punishment as a way to modify behavior necessarily, although today we are actually talking about the use of punishment or how we get this basic principle of punishment and sort of package it in a way to change behavior. But punishment, when we say that punishment is it's a basic behavioral procedure, we're essentially saying punishment is something that exists in nature, and there's really nothing we can do about it. We can avoid using punishment as a way to modify behavior, and we actually do, but it's just a fact of life. You engage in a lot of behaviors throughout the day, and some of those behaviors produce reinforcement, they pay off. Some other behaviors don't pay off, so they produce, in a way, what we refer to as extinction, contingencies. And some behaviors actually produce aversive contingencies, they, punishment. Those of you, we're all in isolation, so you may decide to dye your hair, and maybe you try a new color and it looks terrible. So the likelihood that you're going to use that color again in the future is reduced, right? So your behavior of dyeing your hair at home got punished in a sense that it decreased the future frequency in the future. So again, punishment, we define punishment as any behavior that produces a consequence. In this case, just like reinforcement, but differently than reinforcement, behavior decreases in the future, as opposed to reinforcement, in which the consequence makes behavior increase in the future. The difference, of course, just like with reinforcement, there's a difference between positive and negative, right? So positive reinforcement, you have a consequence that is added, and that's why behavior increases in the future due to this addition of this consequence. In the case of positive punishment, same thing. Now behavior is reduced due to the addition of a consequence. So you engage in behavior, something happens, something gets added, and then behavior reduces in the future. With negative punishment, something is taken away. And that's essentially what we're going to be talking about. So there's a certain state of affairs, you engage in the behavior, and things get worse in a sense. And that's why behavior gets reduced in the future, right? Behavior reduces. The frequency of behavior is reduced in the future. Now, if punishment is used as a way to modify behavior, it's rarely used in behavior analysis, although I'll tell you some examples of procedures that we don't consider to be punishment, but they usually work that way. So a lot of procedures that we don't refer to as punishment, either positive or negative, they may be reducing behavior through this sort of punishment mechanism. So again, when punishment is used in applied behavior analysis, is often used after a functional intervention has been implemented or at least considered. No one starts by changing behavior using punishment. You would want to know why behavior is occurring in the first place, right? So you would want to do a functional assessment or functional analysis. You would want to identify the cause or the antecedent and the consequence for the behavior. And then, of course, you're going to want to go through some of those functional based interventions that we talked about. You're going to try to use extinction and differential reinforcement. and antecedent manipulations to reduce behavior. Now, if you've implemented those, if you identify the function of the behavior accurately and correctly, and then if you implemented those procedures with fidelity, then the likelihood that you're going to have to resort to punishment is very low. So you're likely not going to have to get to punishment if you have conducted functional assessment and implemented a functional intervention. There are some cases in which, even after implementing a functional-based intervention, behavior has not been reduced to the levels it needs to. Sometimes we're talking about severe behavior that is quite dangerous to the individual or others, that you may not have the luxury of waiting until something like differential reinforcement procedure is effective. Or as I'm going to mention a little later, oftentimes um, differential punishment may be used or should be used with some form of differential reinforcement. So remember, when we talked about differential reinforcement, we were talking about reinforcing the appropriate behavior and putting the inappropriate behavior under extinction. It is possible to use differential reinforcement. So instead of putting the problem behavior under extinction, there might be a punishment contingency for the problem behavior, in which case you may be able to reduce the problem behavior faster, right? So imagine a situation where you have some severe self-injury and maybe that behavior is maintained by attention. You could teach an alternative response, like let's say request for attention, or a way to request for attention, whether you do it using vocal behavior or some sort of picture exchange system, because you want to replace the problem behavior with that communication form. Now, what happens with the problem behavior? Well, if the problem behavior occurs, based on the chapter on differential reinforcement, we will put the problem behavior under extinction, and the appropriate behavior would produce reinforcement. But it might be that this procedure would still take a little bit of time for the behavior, the appropriate behavior to increase and the problem behavior to decrease. And it's also possible that you cannot afford having the problem behavior occur, so you place it under extinction. You might not be able to tolerate an extinction burst. In this case, you might be able to use punishment for the problem behavior. So you would have reinforcement for the appropriate behavior, but then if the problem behavior occurs, the problem behavior may contact some sort of punishment contingency. And this may happen because the punishment contingency, differently from extinction, suppresses behavior usually faster. Remember, extinction often has a burst, right? You see an increase in behavior before a decrease. Even though differential reinforcement or reinforcing appropriate behavior may reduce the possibility of extinction burst, in some cases, the punishment procedure may be a little bit more efficient in suppressing behavior right away. Now, even though in some cases punishment may be necessary, punishment can be quite controversial, right? So there's definitely several ethical discussions about whether punishment should and when punishment should be used. In the next chapter, there's going to be a whole section on the ethics of punishment. So we'll talk about negative punishment in this chapter. Then we'll talk about positive punishment and all the different kinds of positive punishment. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about the ethics of using punishment. And so we can decide, we can talk about like when would it be okay to use punishment, when would not be okay to use punishment, especially in light of all the possible side effects that the procedure may produce, right? So this chapter is going to focus on two common forms. We're going to be talking about negative punishment in the form of timeout and response cost. So we'll talk about those two procedures. Now, the majority of you have either experienced those procedures in your own life, right? Your parents may have implemented a form of timeout or response cost, and same, either exclusionary or inclusionary timeout. So we'll talk about those. So you may have some flashbacks from when you were a kid or when you were a teenager in terms of things that your parents may have implemented. Now, notice that your parents may have implemented those procedures without knowing necessarily the behavior mechanisms behind them, but just something that is sort of common sense, right? I mean, a lot of parents and a lot of teachers may implement those procedures because traditionally they've been things that folks have implemented as part of their parenting or education. Now, there's some common issues regarding punishment. We talked about the fact that the difference between positive and negative punishment. Well, usually punishment is easy to implement. And that is an advantage and a disadvantage, right? Because punishment, why is punishment easy to implement? Usually because if you're going to implement some sort of punishment contingency to reduce problem behavior, well, you actually don't need to identify the function of the behavior, right? So imagine, I always like to give the examples of one of my dogs, right? So imagine one of my dog barks a lot, right? So I could just say, okay, barking a lot, especially now that I'm teaching classes online, I mean, him barking around will not necessarily be a good thing. So barking could be considered, or excessive barking could be considered a problem behavior. Now, if I wanted to reduce that behavior, I could just, punish it. Some folks have bark collars, right, or shock collars. So if the dog barks, you have like a brief electrical discharge immediately after the behavior. In this case, the barking or the considered to be problem behavior. Now, if this reduces behavior in the future, we would consider this to be a form of punishment, right? So again, this will be positive punishment, right? Because there is no aversive stimulus, no shock. The animal barks, and now shock is produced. Now, this will be very easy to implement. Like all you need to do is, press a button, and then immediately after barking, the animal gets shocked. And I think in some cases it's even automatic, like the system detects when the animal is barking. Now, you don't need to identify the reason why the behavior occurred in the first place, any of the antecedents that trigger the behavior. You just punish it. And because it is so easy, the likelihood that people are going to misuse it, so use it for everything now, like I'm going to punish anything I don't like, and the possibility of misuse and then abuse, it's much greater, right, than using any of the other procedures. Now, there's the likelihood of harm, of course. In the case of the use of aversive stimulus, we talked about early in the semester about habituation. I mean, folks may actually habituate to that pain. And if the dog gets used to the shock, then how do you make the shock aversive? Well, you have to increase the voltage. And then after you increase the voltage, if the animal gets used to it, then you have to increase even more. So you start seeing how this is pretty clear abuse, right? And it may cause harm. So because of it, the acceptability is much lower than using any of the other procedures. I mean, if you had a child that was misbehaving and the teacher came to you and said, well, we would like to use some sort of physical punishment, you would likely say, of course not. I don't even do that. There's lots of problems that this would generate, lots of side effects that this would generate. We find people find a negative punishment a little less problematic, right? So we'll talk about that today. So timeout or response cost is considered to be a little less problematic, but it still involves removal of reinforcers, which it's not necessarily a pleasant procedure. So I'm sure that when your parents grounded you or put you on timeout or removed things that you had, and now you engage in problem behavior, now you don't have those things anymore, you don't have access to those things anymore. I doubt that you guys are happy about that you're like thrilled about having to miss the party because you misbehave. So no one is happy about contacting punishment contingencies, whether it's positive or negative. So it definitely produces emotional reactions, right? So there's also a philosophical opposition to punishment, because we need to always focus on the least restrictive intervention, right? So the idea that you go from simple to less restrictive to more restrictive as needed, right? Just like when we talk about prompting, you would start with the least restrictive form of prompting, and you will get to physical prompting if you have to. I think it's the same with aversive events. That's like your last resort, right? You should have tried everything else before you have to resort to an aversive procedure. for, like I said, because of abuse, because of the rights that we have as humans to not contact that kind of contingency. And I think the most important part, when I was talking about punishment being easy to implement, part of it too is that you don't really have to understand the reason why the behavior occurred in the first place. So if my dog is barking and that's annoying to me, well, yeah, I can just put a shock collar and then shock the hell out of the dog every time he barks. But I'm not solving the problem really, because I'm not understanding why the dog is barking in the first place. So what are the reasons why the dog is barking? So is the dog barking to alert me that someone is at home? So the function of that is to get my attention, right? Or is the dog barking because he wants me to throw the ball? Now, those are all reasons why the dog will be barking. If I punish the behavior, if I make him stop barking, I'm essentially removing his way of telling me something. And then how is he going to tell me now if someone is at the house? How is he going to tell me that he wants to play fetch? He doesn't have an alternative behavior. So I'm not really teaching him to obtain the reinforcers that he so much wanted using a different strategy. What I'm doing is I'm essentially just, removing the only way that he has to obtain the reinforcer that he so much wants. So again, I think that's terrible. It's unethical. So punishment in so many ways, it's really not a solution. That's why throughout the chapter you will see the author saying, if punishment needs to be used, it needs to be combined with some sort of differential reinforcement. So if I need to punish the barking, I need to teach my dog to do something else that would produce the same reinforcer that barking was producing. And in order to do that, I need to run a functional assessment to understand why the barking is occurring in the first place. And if I'm doing a functional assessment, then I might as well just use reinforcement and extinction. I might not need to use punishment at all, right? So if the dog is barking because he wants to play fetch, then could I just teach my dog to go grab the ball and then drop it on my feet? And then if he does that, of course, I need to be consistent and reinforce his behavior every time he does it. And then if he barks, I can just walk away, right? That should be enough, right? I might not need to use any form of punishment in this case. So let's talk about timeout. Timeout is the first kind of procedure that I wanted to talk to you guys about. So when we have timeout, notice why is a negative reinforcement contingency. So you have the timeout following the problem behavior. Now, in this case, I'm going to give the example of the child. A lot of those procedures are used with kids. So the child is removed from the reinforcing environment for a brief period of time, right? So now we're assuming that the child is in an environment that is reinforcing. So then removing the child from the environment is what I refer to as the opposite of improvement. I like to use the word deprovement, even though the word doesn't exist, but I like it. So there's a deprovement in conditions, but there's only a deprovement, of course, if the environment is reinforcing, right? And if the environment is reinforcing, then you should see a decrease of the problem behavior in the future. So it's only timeout, a form of negative punishment, if the removal of the child from the reinforcing environment reduces the future probability of the problem behavior in similar circumstances. So there's two different kinds of timeout. Does anyone remember what they're called? You can type on the chat box. We can try this out to see if we can be interactive. So one of them is called exclusionary. How about the other one? Does anyone remember? Is the chat box working? Maybe it's not working. The other one is called inclusionary. So let's talk about exclusionary timeout. So with exclusionary timeout, the person here is removed from the reinforcing environment where the problem behavior occurred. And in this case, is taken to another room, right? So here you have reinforcing environment. So let's imagine, I think the book gives an example of like a child playing with other kids in the school setting. maybe engages some sort of disruptive behavior, and now is taken to a different room, right? So in this case, it's taken to a different room. So you're removing the person from all sources of positive reinforcement. So again, some of the examples like sitting out in the hallway or the principal's office. Again, most of the exclusionary timeout examples I think that you find in the book are related to timeout being used in schools. But parents might also do timeout, right? So kid engages in problem behavior. Can anyone think about an exclusionary timeout? So what would parents do if the kid is in the living room and maybe is playing video games and starts cursing, and parents said you shouldn't be cursing? Can you think of what would the parents do that would consist of a timeout? Anyone? Yep. So in this case, you put the kid in the corner. If you put the kid in the corner, though, is this exclusionary timeout or is it inclusionary or non-exclusionary? So let's think about it. So give a second here. So Ruth said, put a kid in the corner. So let's define non-exclusionary first. So in non-exclusionary, the person remains in the room while being removed from access to the positive reinforcer. So in this case, Ruth's example is non-exclusionary because maybe the kid is playing video game, curses, and then the parents say, you have to go in the corner, but the kid can still see the video game console, right? So the kid's still there. If it was exclusionary, then where would you send the kid to? You may send the kid to the room. Yeah, exactly. So go to your room, right? So in this case, it would be exclusionary. So exclusionary, you exclude the child from the environment, and then non-exclusionary, the person is not excluded from the environment. So that's a good way to remember the differences between exclusionary and non-exclusionary. How do you choose? Does anyone want to try? Like, why would you use exclusionary versus non-exclusionary? Yeah, that's a good one. So Sydney says whether is maintained by attention. You're right. If the behavior is maintained by attention, and a lot of the times the timeout, it kind of only works if is maintained by attention. Ruth says also depends on the behavior. It's correct, right? So let's say, or Charlotte said depends on the behavior, the function. So let's think about this for a second. So if the majority of behaviors that you would use timeout for would probably be behaviors maintained either by attention or behaviors maintained by some sort of tangible or positive reinforcement, right? Because if you think about it, if the behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement or escape, taking the child away from the environment will make the behavior worse, right? Because that means the child wants to leave the environment to start with, like I'm engaging in problem behavior from the kid because I don't want to do this. So then when you take me away, that's exactly what I want. So that makes the behavior worse. But if the behavior is maintained by attention from my peers, for example, and I'm there in the classroom and I'm playing with the peers and I'm being disruptive, but they're looking at me and they're laughing, and that's the reinforcer. If I'm engaging this problem behavior maintained by attention, if you put me in the corner, like the picture that we have on the PowerPoint, I may still hear my friends. I may still be contacting some of the reinforcement. So that might not work. You might have to take me away from that environment, right? Because that otherwise the procedure is not going to work because I'm still contacting the reinforcement. So in this case, maybe exclusionary will be better. It's also, yes, exactly. So Ruth says, I'm assuming is based on the function. If behavior is maintained by escape, well, if the behavior is maintained by escape, you're probably not going to use timeout. But if the behavior is maintained by, the attention from others, then exclusionary might be the way to go. But if the behavior is maintained by tangible, then just putting the kid in the corner might be enough because the kid will not have access to the toys that the other kids are playing with. Now, notice that there might be some other reasons, right? So some people say, the other, it could be on the type of the behavior. If the behavior, let's say it's cursing, and you put like on a non-exclusionary timeout, and you put the kid in the corner in the same room as the other kids, that kid might be cursing the whole time, and you'll be very disruptive for the rest of the classroom. So it might have to be exclusionary. There's also some logistical issues, right? So there might not be another room where you can take the child. So you may have to do non-exclusionary versus exclusionary. So there are different ways in which you would use this procedure. But oftentimes you will not use the procedure if the behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement, because you could make the behavior worse, because you're removing the individual from the environment. And if the behavior is maintained by a negative reinforcement, that suggests that the environment is aversive and the child engages in problem behavior to produce the removal of the task or the removal of the environment. So if now the child engages in the problem behavior and you give time out, you remove the kid from the environment, you could actually be making the behavior worse, right? So that's the point here. And there have been some studies suggesting that if timeout is used without really understanding the function of the behavior, you could actually make the behavior worse. So I said, so I guess, so those are the things that we talked about. Non-exclusionary, when the person can be removed from the reinforcing activities while it's still in the room. And the presence of the person in the room would not be disruptive. So that's the example I gave earlier about the kid cursing in the front of others. If one or both of these criteria cannot be met, then exclusionary timeout should be used, right? Now, as I mentioned earlier, reinforcement usually should be used with timeout. Timeout eliminate access to positive reinforcers contingent on problem behavior, right? So it's important for the person to actually have access to some of the reinforcers. So like I mentioned earlier, you could use timeout as a way to decrease the problem behavior, but still be focusing on teaching an appropriate response, either using DRA or DRO. So let's say kid is playing with the other kids in the classroom and then maybe engages in some sort of disruptive behavior. You can take the kid away from the classroom, right? And say, okay, now you're in timeout, as a way of reducing that problem behavior. But it will be important to teach the kid how to interact with the other kids. So if the kid is engaging in disruptive behavior, to get all the kids' attention or to play with a toy that another kid is playing with. So can we teach that kid that is engaging the problem behavior how to have access to the toys that she wants in an appropriate manner, right? Or can we deliver the reinforcer in the absence of the problem behavior, which would be the case of DRO. In that sense, you're not just removing reinforcers. You are still delivering reinforcers that the kid wants, but you're delivering them in the presence of appropriate behaviors. And that's what I said. Like without any differential reinforcement, all you're doing is taking things away. So there's this sort of overall net loss of reinforcers. And because of that, there's some ethical concerns and the fact that problem behavior will likely reemerge, right? So the example that I gave earlier about my dog, if I just, let's say put my dog in timeout every time he barks, so I'll take him away and put him somewhere where he doesn't have access to anyone or anything. He's just losing reinforcement. And yeah, maybe his barking would decrease, but if I don't teach him anything else, whenever he wants to play with me again, guess what he's going to do? He's going to bark, because that's the behavior that had a long history of reinforcement, and that's the thing that he has learned to do, right? So again, it's important that differential reinforcement is attached to any of these procedures that we're talking about today. Other considerations to using timeout. Again, what's the function of the problem behavior? Just talked about that. Unless you know what the function is, you won't be able to reinforce any alternative behavior. Usually, as I said, timeout is appropriate for positive reinforcement functions if the behavior is maintained by either attention or tangible. And the time in has to be reinforcing, because otherwise taking the kid away from that time in will not reduce behavior, right? So it has to, there has to be a contrast between the environment that the kid is currently in, um, from that environment to the new environment, which is the, you know, removal or the exclusionary environment. So there has to be a change from being in a positive place to being in a less positive place. Otherwise, you're not going to see a decrease in behavior. I already talked about this. It's not appropriate for negative reinforcement, behavior maintained by negative reinforcement. It's also not appropriate for behaviors that are maintained by automatic reinforcement. So if the behavior occurs because of automatic reinforcement, meaning the behavior produces some form of sensory stimulation, and that's why the behavior is occurring, timeout is not going to work. And why isn't timeout going to work in situations like that? Can you think about it, why timeout is not going to work? Um, well, timeout's not going to work in this situation because the person can engage. Yeah, exactly. The person. The student's answer: you're not changing the sort of internal condition, and meaning the reinforcement is being provided by the child itself or the behavior itself. So the reinforcer is going to be contacted and produced in both environments, right? In the time in, you put the kid in timeout, the kid is still going to engage in the problem behavior and produce the same reinforcer. So it's really the likelihood that you're going to see a decrease in behavior, in automatically reinforced behavior using timeout, is not going to be very high. So you're not going to see that. We talked about logistics too. So is the timeout practical in the given situation? Meaning, can the change agents implement it with fidelity? So can you actually do it every time the problem behavior occurs? Because if not, sometimes problem behavior would produce reinforcement, and that you would have this situation where the behavior is being intermittently reinforced, which could make the behavior even worse, right? Is the physical environment conducive to its use, meaning, do you have another room? Do you have a way to see what the client is doing in their room? Is their room safe? Um, you know, uh, I can imagine like horror stories of, I mean, imagine you have a room that you cannot see what's happening there, or maybe the room has some furniture that the client can engage in problem behavior and get, hurt. Um, those are all issues that are problematic. Is the timeout safe? So I talked about that. So is it a safe environment? And sometimes also you want to make sure that not only you can observe the client, but that the timeout period is brief. Now, the research has suggested that you don't need to go you don't have to go beyond 3-4 minutes. Usually around 1 to 10 minutes is it's what the book suggests. But in practice, timeout tends to be quite short, because it's really the removal from the reinforcing environment to the non-reinforcing environment that is functioning as the punishment. The amount of time you stay outside or stay in the time out, it's not necessarily that important. So you want to be returned to the time in environment as soon as possible. And a lot of times what folks use is this thing called contingent delay. So if you place the kid in timeout, so let's go back to the example when the child is cursing. If the child is cursing a lot and that's the problem behavior. Child is cursing while playing video games. The parents say, okay, now you go to your room. Well, if the child is cursing all the time she's in her room, well, you wouldn't want to be like, okay, let's wait 5 minutes. And in 5 minutes, I'll let you out. And the kid is cursing during the whole 5 minutes. And then you let the kid out. What's the problem with that? What could you be reinforcing in the situation? You could be reinforcing cursing, exactly. So the kid is cursing, and then immediately after the kid curses, you let the kid out. So that is why people use contingent delay, right? So if the problem behavior, so you can say, okay, you're going to be in your room for 5 minutes without access to the video game, or 10 minutes. But the child has to be quiet. If the child curses when it's time for me to get the child out of the timeout, then you have to wait another, you reset the clock. So you kind of wait an additional few minutes to get the kid out. I've seen timeout used in different ways. When I worked in an institution for individuals with severe disabilities, sometimes timeout was actually used not only as a procedure to reduce problem behavior, but also as a safety mechanism in this way. If the child is engaging behavior that could be quite aggressive or destructive to the environment or to others, then putting that individual in timeout would prevent the individual from hurting others and hurting himself or herself. And hopefully, of course, the timeout is serving as negative punishment, so you would see a decrease in behavior. In those situations, there were lots of interesting things that were important or features of the timeout. First, the room was very safe, and it was there was absolutely no way that the individual could harm himself or herself. Two, the door had like a glass sort of a window, so you could see what was happening, and you also could not lock the room. So there was actually this mechanism where you had to put your hand on this sort of a um, like there was a square outside, and you put your hand in there, and then you will lock the door. There was like a magnet sort of mechanism. You put your hand and you lock the door, but if you removed your hand, the door would open. So there was no way for anyone to accidentally leave the individual there and forget the individual there. So that was something that was required in order for that institution to use timeout. So the whole time that the individual is in timeout, there's someone observing the individual. There's no way you could walk away. And in some of those situations, the individual either had to not be engaging the problem behavior to be let out, or the individual may have to engage in some appropriate behavior. So I've seen situations in which you would ask the individual to follow some engage in some tasks or comply with some tasks before leaving the timeout room. So, you could ask the individual to answer some questions calmly, and then after the individual, let's say, answer like 3-4 questions calmly, you can let the individual go. So this would be a way to not reinforce inappropriate behavior and actually let the individual out or reinforce appropriate compliance, right? So that's a way to make sure that you're not reinforcing problem behavior contingent upon letting the individual from the timeout into the time in. The book talks about research finding mixed, but I think most recent studies have suggested that this contingent delay, it's the way to go, right? You don't want the individual to get out of the timeout if he or she is engaging in problem behavior. Of course, if you can escape from the timeout, then maybe timeout is not a good procedure to be used. Again, that might not be what you want to do. Like I talked about using calm instructions and physical guidance. I've seen folks take individuals to timeout while giving the individual so much attention, like talking to the person. You don't want to do any of that, because if the behavior is maintained by attention, then problem behavior occurs. And instead of just taking the individual into the timeout, you're like providing a lot of reinforcement while taking the individual during the timeout. And that would not be necessarily a good thing, because now you may have an individual engaging in problem behavior. So he could get you to escort him or her into timeout, and that could be a problem. And that's essentially the point number 6. You want interactions to be avoided during the timeout. No reprimands, explanations, or any other form of attention while you're taking the individual to timeout. Of course, you may give the individuals instructions. I'm sure that when you went into timeout in your life, your parents may have told you, like, listen, if you curse again, I'm going to put you in timeout, or if you do this or you do that, I'm going to put you in timeout. But the effective way of doing it is that once you engage in the problem behavior, your parents would just squirt into the timeout. And whether you're complaining or not, that behavior will not be reinforced. And the timeout, of course, needs to be acceptable, right? Some agencies serving clients govern all the punishment procedures, and a lot of places you can't just use any punishment. So there's regulations, a lot of times state regulations permitting or not the use of punishment and the kinds of punishment procedures that can be used, and of course, what's acceptable to parents or guardians of the individuals. A lot of parents use those procedures, of course, but if those procedures are to be used by someone else, then of course you need consent for those procedures to be used. So again, how do you use timeout? You would want to start with a functional assessment and implement all the procedures that we talked about prior to this chapter. So you would want to do a functional assessment, find out if the behavior is maintained by positive or negative, social or automatic reinforcement, and then use antecedent manipulation based on the information that you have, use differential reinforcement with extinction, and then try to solve the problem this way, right? Without having to resort to any punishment. If those procedures have not been effective and for some reason you have to resort to timeout, maybe because you need the behavior to be reduced more rapidly, then you need to make sure that you're removing the individual from an environment that is reinforcing. So the timing environment must be reinforcing. Desirable behaviors also need to be reinforced. So even if you are using timeout, you would want to use some differential reinforcement procedures. So you would want to reinforce appropriate behaviors when they do occur. When the problem behavior does occur, you wanted to take the child or whoever it is that you're taking to the timeout area, again, immediately, right? Sometimes you can't take it immediately. You might have to say, like, you're going to be in timeout. I'm going to take you to timeout a little later. But if it's not, the timeout's not immediately, then if the individual understands what you're saying, then just telling the person he or she is going to go into timeout will function as punishment, right? Of course, as long as you then implement the procedure. Otherwise, people won't believe you, right? Because then every time you say, like, I'm going to put you in timeout, if you never put the individual in timeout, eventually he or she would realize that you're full of empty threats, right? Again, we talked about providing no attention when taking the individual into the timeout, and the timeout must be brief, must be practical, and must be safe. And no attention or no reinforcers during the timeout. Timeout cannot, the individual cannot escape the timeout. And then, of course, the individual must be calm and not engaging in the problem behavior before releasing him or her from the timeout. And as I mentioned earlier, that's a procedure. When you're using any punishment procedure, there must be consent. There's some common errors. I'm not going to talk about them, but you can see them in the PowerPoint when I post it. And a lot of them have to do with the fact that individuals may do those things and then reinforce inappropriate behavior inadvertently when they're implementing timeout. Now, the next topic in this chapter is response cost. So I've already been talking for quite a while. So what I'll do is I'll see if you guys have any specific questions about timeout or any other questions. And if not, then of course, I'll continue on this chapter next class, and I'll go into response cost next. Any questions that you guys may have that you want to type in, and I'll try to answer. If not, then I'm going to stop the recording, and I'll still be here for a few more minutes if you guys have other questions related to the rest of the course or anything else that you would want to know. So I'm going to see if I can stop the